Now here in Unit 4 of AP Euro, we've been talking an awful lot about the thinky people, what with my previous two videos on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But for this video, let's bring it all the way back down to earth and talk about European society in the 18th century. And the main thing to know is that the population of Europe was growing significantly during this period, and so we need to find out the causes of that growth and its consequences. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. And by the way, if you want follow-along notes for this video and all my videos, then check the link in the description. So in the 18th century, the European population exploded. The first half of the century saw somewhat modest growth from about 120 million in 1700 to 140 million in 1750. And look, you don't need to remember those numbers, I'm just mentioning them to give you a sense of the scale. And then in the second half of the 18th century, that growth rate doubled. I know! During that half of the century, the population increased from 140 million to 190 million. So what's going on? Why are there so many dang people populating Europe during this time? Well, the main reason was a significant decline in the death rate, which, if it's not obvious, is the rate at which people, die. So if there's a decline in the death rate, that means people are living longer lives. And thanks in large part to the Columbian Exchange, which I have talked about ad nauseum in other videos, the diets of Europeans became more varied and the abundance of food available increased as well. Additionally, this century saw improved means for transporting food, like improved roads and canals and other infrastructure projects, and new means of storing food so that it stayed fresh longer. Also, farmers saw significant increases in their crop yields. By 1750, the surplus food supply in Europe was at about 50%, which is to say Europeans had like 50% more food than they needed to stay alive. So food is helping everyone live longer, but another factor was the disappearance of the bubonic plague from Europe. Now, it didn't entirely go away, but the last major outbreak occurred in France in 1720, and with that gone, huge swaths of the population weren't being taken out by other people's nasty germs. Now, in general, those were the two main factors contributing to the longer lives of Europeans, both of which contributed to the decline of the death rate. And I know the question that's burning in your mind right now, what about the birth rate? What a perceptive question, let me tell you. So people were living longer, but were more people being added to the population through birth? So on average, families had about 5 children during the childbearing years. While it seems like it would contribute to the increasing population during this period, not so much. First, that 5 children per family number only accounts for women who were married. At any given point during this period, something like 40 to 60% of the women in childbearing years remained single. So only about half the population was having kids at that rate. The second reason is that in places like Britain and France, especially in the upper classes, birth control methods were increasingly being used to limit the number of children born from about 5 down to an average of 2. And you might wonder, what about all those single women? Weren't they having any babies? Yes, they were, and the unflattering term for a baby born out of wedlock was an illegitimate child. So illegitimate births definitely increased during this period. For example, by 1800 in Germany, a full 10% of births were illegitimate. And while this reality may have contributed some to the population growth, it was not enough to offset the decline in the birth rate. Therefore, the real cause of the population explosion was longer life expectancy. Okay, now we need to take a closer look at all that new food that helped Europeans live longer lives, and for that, I need to talk yet again about the agricultural revolution. But first, some context. Back in the 17th century, agriculture was on occasion significantly disrupted by weather events or low productivity agricultural practices and small land holdings, and let me give you an example of such disruption with each of those. First, a centuries-long weather event known as the Little Ice Age occurred from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Now, in the midst of this Little Ice Age, there were colder periods which ruined crop yields and caused much hunger and suffering, and then there were warmer periods which increased crop yields. Well, the 17th century happened to be one of those colder periods, and that led to a lot of hunger and a higher death rate. Second, in the 17th century, innovations that we've talked about before, like the 2-field system and the 3-field system, were able to keep pace with the increasing population, but now the population was increasing beyond the capacity of those systems. And third, in the 17th century, much of the farmland available for cultivation was contained in small plots owned by individuals. And if a family's crop failed, they were in serious trouble. Okay, so all that happened in the 17th century, and we're talking about the 18th century in this video. So by the 18th century, with all these new mouths to feed, the agricultural revolution is going to solve these 3 problems. Now, while historians argue whether or not there was an agricultural revolution, several new practices produced more food for the growing population. First, the 2- and 3-field systems were abandoned. Remember that those systems worked by leaving a portion of the land fallow for a year so that the soil could replenish its nutrients. But now it was discovered that planting other nitrogen-rich crops like clover could replenish the soil. And bonus, those fields of clover now provided more grazing land for livestock. And if there's more livestock, there's more meat available for Europeans to stuff into their mouth holes. Second, during the 18th century, and particularly the second half of the 18th century, crop yields significantly increased. This happened to be one of the warmer periods of the Little Ice Age, and so potato and maize crops, thanks Columbian Exchange, yielded far more than they previously did, livelihood, and that was especially significant for the lower classes. And third, more land came under cultivation during this time. New farming techniques and technologies like Jethro Tull's seed drill worked best on larger commercial farms, and so in this period, we're going to witness the increasing commercialization of farms. Therefore, small farmers were forced to consolidate their land into larger commercial farms because they simply couldn't compete. And the most notorious effort here was the Enclosure Acts in England, which gave legal justification to this large-scale land seizure. All right, now let's talk about families. As Europeans in the upper classes had children during this time, societal attitudes toward children began to change. Now, the prevailing attitude before this is that children were just miniature adults. But thanks to the influence of Enlightenment thought, childhood became a distinct developmental stage. And one of the most significant folks to help foster this change was Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his little book called Émile. His goal in this book was to promote the education of children. Because Rousseau believed in the social contract, which argued that citizens were responsible for governing themselves, Rousseau argued that such a weighty responsibility required the dedicated education of children. Therefore, in part because of Rousseau's influence, childhood became, at least in the minds of the elite, a distinct phase of development that needed nurture and attention. Now, that was not the case with the working class. In their family economies, whether urban or rural, children were needed for the survival of the family. Therefore, children worked right alongside their parents on the farms or in the cottage industry or at their parents' trade. Now, in terms of the whole family unit, the nuclear family, which is to say parents and children and not the entire extended family, was the growing norm and had been since the Middle Ages. That meant that once men and women got married, they established their household apart from their parents. However, to do so required no small amount of boom boom, and therefore men and women in general married later in life, which is to say in their mid to late 20s. And that's pretty late when you consider that the expected lifespan of a European back then was like 50. And the last thing we need to talk about is migration. Largely because of the technological advances like the steel plow and the seed drill, fewer workers were required to work on farms. Therefore, in order to find work, many rural folks moved to the city, a process known as urbanization. But as this began to occur on a large scale, cities were crushed by the onslaught of people streaming in, and that created some problems. First, there wasn't enough housing for all these people. So to solve that problem, a new kind of housing was created called the tenement. These were hastily constructed apartment buildings which had rooms that workers could rent for a pretty low price. However, they were not well ventilated and there was no indoor plumbing. The poor ventilation meant that airborne diseases like tuberculosis could spread rapidly. And then no indoor plumbing meant that people had to take their waste and throw it out the window onto the street. So needless to say, the cities were stanky and profoundly unsanitary. And so with all these working poor crowding into the cities, other urban residents were faced with the problems of poverty like crime and prostitution. In order to address these problems, authorities passed laws meant to eradicate them. And a good example is England's Vagrancy Act of 1822, which was meant to crack down on prostitution. Alright, click right here for more videos reviewing Unit 4 of AP Euro. If you need even more help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right here and grab my AP Euro review pack, which is going to make all your dreams come true. I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.